Hello everyone, Max here with Fiction Rant to bring you part 3 of the Federation from Star Trek versus the Galactic Empire from Star Wars, a full breakdown with rules and different matchup scenarios. Also, I have links to my Patreon, Coffee, and Fourth Wall in the description if you'd like to support the channel. I'd like to do a breakdown just like this one for a matchup between the Protoss and Eldar, but I've been putting it off because, well, it intimidates me. So I decided to host the discussion on the subject on my Patreon if you want to join the discussion there, prior to actually making a video series. Basically, I'd like to try to be as accurate as possible, and there's just so much information available. And a lot of it comes from things like novels, and I'm not going to read all the novels. Alright then, on to the matchup. This will be part 3 of 8, where I cover the weapons used by each side. Again, this will be the Galactic Empire as of the Battle of Endor, except the Rebellion doesn't exist, versus the Federation as of the Dominion War. And this is also prior to Voyager coming back and providing all of its materials and all that kind of stuff. As a generalization, the Federation uses particle beams called phasers, which shoot fictional nadion particles at near light speed to damage targets. These nadion particles by themselves liberate atomic nuclei and disrupt nuclear forces, ultimately just causing matter to disintegrate with higher power levels causing more and more damage. The Federation also makes use of a couple types of torpedoes, from photon torpedoes, which are essentially antimatter nukes, to quantum torpedoes, which are zero-point energy nukes, to tricobalt devices, which essentially are just high-energy demolition charges which have very little actual combat use beyond cracking things like starbases. Meanwhile, the Empire is all about their blasters of various sizes. These are a tad weird since they're referred to as lasers, described as particle beams, but behave like plasma cannons. Since the writers for Star Wars have demonstrated a near-complete lack of grasp of how things actually work while just applying cool-sounding names to things with zero additional thought, I'm going to be sticking with explaining blasters as plasma cannons since that actually explains any amount of their behavior. They don't fire in beams, so they're not lasers or particle beams. They use a gas as a medium, so they're still not lasers, and they don't even travel close to light speed, so they're not lasers or particle beams. They're plasma cannons. Other than their various sizes of blasters, the Empire makes limited use of concussion missiles, proton torpedoes, fusion bombs, thermal detonators, super lasers, and the occasional lightsaber, as well as ion cannons. I would touch on things like seismic charges, but the only people we ever see use those things are Boba and Jango Fett, and they're not Imperials, so including their kit alongside everything else would just be like including Tusken Raider cycler rifles among stormtrooper weaponry. It would be kind of inappropriate. Alright, moving into the nitty-gritty. We'll start with the ground forces and start with the Federation side of things. On the ground, the Federation makes use of various classes and styles of phasers, from tiny hand phasers to phaser pistols to phaser rifles and compression rifles. I would get super specific about how much power all these things actually deliver, but it really doesn't even matter. Even the smallest phasers can be set anywhere from stun, to kill, to vaporize. So in terms of lethality, they've pretty much got things covered. Phasers are actually quite versatile due to their settings, including being able to be used on low power to just warm up rocks as an improvised campfire, to being set to wide beam so that Tuvok can stun everyone on the bridge of the Voyager on a single shot. When things get serious, though, that's when Starfleet breaks out the heavy guns, those being phaser rifles and compression phasers, which do more of the same, just better. They also had a certain thing which is a hilariously bad idea, but it's in the original series episode Arena, so it still counts. Photon mortars. Think of a nuke capable of leveling a decent-sized hill, which is the size of a baseball. What could possibly go wrong? There's also a few other fringe items like weaponized holograms and TR-116 rifle, but they aren't exactly standard issue, so I won't be considering them for the matchup. Moving on to the Imperial ground forces, the weapon doing almost all the heavy lifting is the E-11 blaster. These are plentifully lethal against lightly or unarmored targets, but don't actually have a ton of penetration power or really much power at all, so anything short of a body or head shot won't actually be lethal, as Princess Leia heavily demonstrates when she gets shot in the shoulder. The E-11 is also capable of being set for stun, which by all appearances seems to fire a wide dispersion shot, which would be hard to avoid, but then there's this bit where Ahsoka is training against clone troopers and she's still able to block stun rounds with a lightsaber, so despite all appearances their coverage seems to be pretty limited despite them looking like a giant AoE. Moving up in the world to vehicles, you basically get the same thing as the E-11 blaster, but bigger and badder, from AT-ST cannons being able to blast trees apart to AT-AT cannons being able to blow buildings apart. None of them are fundamentally different, the only difference is level of power. Troops can also carry specialized weapons such as ion blasters for taking on droids, thermal detonators, which are basically just souped up grenades. Technically they're fusion grenades, but the yield is still basically that of a couple sticks of TNT, so it's not like you're destroying a building with one. You might gut the building, but you're not destroying it. And of course there's ion grenades, which do more of the same thing as ion blasters, but at an indiscriminate AoE. Ion blasters are interesting. Ion weapons in general are interesting. They do basically nothing against living tissue, but they wreak havoc with electronics. So they're actually and during the Clone Wars, they were used a lot by clone troopers because even friendly fire wouldn't necessarily be lethal. It would screw up your equipment, but it wouldn't kill the trooper. Meanwhile, it would just absolutely thrash the droids. They also have access to things like the E-Web blaster turrets, which are basically just even beefier blasters that fire like a machine gun, but they're big enough that they need to be mounted on a turret. For both blasters and phasers, the range is limited mainly by line of sight. If you can see it, or at least you could at least try to shoot at it. Granted, blasters are significantly harder to hit things at larger distances because of travel time. They actually have a perceptible travel time, as Kylo Ren helpfully demonstrates, but you can still hit stuff at pretty much any terrestrial distance. Finally, to finish off ground weaponry, we have the iconic lightsaber. These elegant weapons from a more civilized age are basically plasma blades, which burn hot enough to melt through doors like butter, but cold enough to not just flash fry Sabine's organs when she's run through in Ahsoka. I know that bit catches a lot of flack, but really Qui-Gon Jinn started it in Episode 1. Sure, he actually died after getting run through by Darth Maul, but he did survive long enough for Obi-Wan to lose a duel really badly before Maul got really dumb and arrogant, giving up the almighty high ground and ending up beside himself, all before Qui-Gon was able to make his dying wish that Obi-Wan make sure that the man who would be responsible for the extermination of the Jedi had a good education. Anyway, lightsabers are not only deadly in combat, but also have the ability to deflect blaster bolts. Granted, doing so without Jedi reflex is basically impossible to do on purpose, but it's a pretty great defensive ability regardless. There's an argument to be made that since phasers don't behave as plasma bolts, even if attempts were made to block a shot, the phaser beam would either just pass straight through the lightsaber blade or only deflect slightly from the interference, but for the sake of the matchup, I'll be assuming that blocking a phaser shot works exactly like blocking a blaster shot and it bounces away. I'll also reiterate here that, just like I mentioned in the speed section, the Federation doesn't really make use of ground armored vehicles. They make use of plenty of shuttles, but to get around on the ground they pretty much just either walk or use the transporter. They don't really do tanks. Alright then, moving into space. Here's where all the fun happens. Unfortunately, the vast majority of demonstrations of power that we get from both turbolasers and phasers are against objects made of MacGuffinite, like other ships, so quantifying how powerful they are is basically impossible based on those demonstrations. That said, we do get some on-screen demonstrations of real-world feats, and even some numbers thrown around on both sides. I'll start with turbolasers by rejecting one of the more common claims about their yield I get all the time. No. Turbolasers don't hit with gigatons of energy. None of them do. This claim is based on a line from one of the cross-section manuals which says that the Venator could divert its entire reactor output through its weapons. Fans took that to mean that the phenomenal power of Star Wars reactors can be shoved through the weapons of any capital ship. Even on its surface, this is an absolutely absurd claim. For one thing, that would require the entire reactor output. That means you don't get shields, engines, artificial gravity, you just get one big dang cannon. For another, just because you have that much power and divert it to one outlet, that doesn't mean that single outlet can handle that kind of output. Think of it this way. The Hoover Dam retains a ton of energy in the form of the water behind it, and gravity. If you shut off every outlet on the Hoover Dam and attach a garden hose as a stand-in for your turbolaser, the fans in question would claim that the resulting beam of water coming from that garden hose would be capable of punching a hole through the hardened steel tank armor. However, if you take a step back and think for a few seconds, you'll realize that all you'll get is a normal trickle of water, albeit relatively high pressure, because sending anything more through a mere garden hose would cause the thing to just blow up like a balloon and burst. So no, turbolasers don't output gigatons of energy. If they did, then every terrestrial impact from a single shot would resemble the destruction of Jedha City from Rogue One, which required a single reactor shot from the freaking Death Star. So what can we go off of then? Well, we have a few options. On the low end, we can go by Ahsoka, where Thrawn's Star Destroyer Chimera rains hellfire upon Ahsoka and her friends, resulting in blasts that resemble rock concert pyrotechnics. And before any of you comment that those were clearly point defense cannons, Look up the Chimera's technical specs. It doesn't have any point defense cannons. It relies upon its fighter complement for that kind of thing. Moving up a bit, we can point to Empire Strikes Back, where a Star Destroyer is seen blowing up asteroids with solitary shots. Assuming that asteroid was actually vaporized and had a composition relatively similar to the asteroids in our own solar system, the shot in question would need to have a yield of about 30 terajoules of energy or 7 kilotons of TNT. Granted, that's a minimum per shot, but the shots do actually stop after hitting the asteroids and don't just blast on through and keep going, so the energy delivered must be in the ballpark of what they can actually do. Back to the realm of the unknown, we actually have real numbers for effective range and targeting. They're not great. The weapons on board the Chimera, Thrawn's ship, have an effective range of 1,200 kilometers, and they're all computer-assisted, but manually aimed and fired. Granted, there's a bit of mixed info here. In the same manual that fans will reference to say that Venator guns could hit with gigatons of energy, it also says that the Venator's 8 DBY-827 heavy turbolaser turrets could hit ships at distances of over 10 light minutes, while being able to rotate 360 degrees in only 3 seconds. In short, none of that is accurate. First of all, 10 light minutes is an insane distance and is demonstrated in every single movie and TV show and corroborated extremely clearly in The Last Jedi. Blaster bolts don't travel at light speed. Not even close. And even if they did, if you actually manage to hit a ship after your shots have been traveling for 10 freaking minutes, they deserve to get blown up. Like, if they have 10 minutes of warning of a blast coming at them and they still get hit, they deserve to die. Regarding that point, there's actually a short clip from YouTuber GE, which shows why the shots in The Last Jedi appear to arc through space. They're not arcing. It's the fact that the bolts aren't moving all that quickly, while both ships are still moving, and that makes that look like that. So yeah, if the bolts are that sluggish, there's no way you're hitting anything even a light second away. 10 light minutes is almost the average distance between Earth and Mars, for crying out loud. Alright, moving on. The fact that ship weapons in Star Wars are also manually aimed and fired, albeit with a bit of computer assistance, is also an issue, is the fact that the turrets are mechanically articulated. This means that if things are flying by quickly enough, you literally cannot turn your weapons fast enough to shoot at them. And also means that if you can shoot at them, given the low speed of the projectiles and the manual targeting, you're going to have a really hard time actually hitting anything ever. This is probably why most capital ships seem to prefer the fly-up alongside and broadside approach to space combat. It's really hard to miss when you're just basically sitting still a couple kilometers away from each other and blazing away. And yet they still miss a lot. I'll touch briefly on the other munitions. Aside from fusion bombs, which can be dropped from TIE bombers for things like the Purging of Mandalore, none of the missiles or torpedoes used by the Empire are nuclear in yield, just high explosive. Sure, we get to see some pretty impressive explosions due to such weapons, but that's because they hit things that explode when damaged. Claiming that proton torpedoes have crazy insane yield because 2 of them blew up the Death Star is something that I've had to argue about in my comment section before, so I'll clarify here. The torpedoes were used to set off a chain reaction. They didn't blow up the Death Star. The Death Star blew up the Death Star. The torpedoes just lit the fuse. Really, claiming that is like saying that tracer rounds carry a couple kilotons of energy because you put a few rounds to a gigantic fuel tank and got it to explode, leveling a building. No, the fuel tank blew up the building, you just set it off. Anywho, the concussion missiles and proton torpedoes are both pretty neat in their own way. Concussion missiles are relatively low yield, but that's because their primary targets are relatively squishy, so they don't need to hit all that hard. They have absolutely amazing tracking capabilities, as Obi-Wan got to see firsthand, but they're also remarkably slow, being only barely faster than the fighters they're meant to counter. Proton torpedoes, meanwhile, are anti-capital ship weapons. They're meant to bypass shields and strike sensitive areas directly, such as ray-shielded thermal exhaust ports, and they're aided in doing so by the fact that they're insanely maneuverable, being able to do things like make a 90-degree turn in about 2 meters of space while moving at full, albeit relatively slow, speed. I'll also touch briefly on ion weaponry, at least on the ship scale. Yes, they're highly effective at bringing down shields and even disabling whole ships. The clearest demonstration we get of this was absolutely Empire Strikes Back, where an entire Star Destroyer is disabled by a couple shots from the ion weapon defending Hoth. The problem is, as you can see by the size of the bolts hitting, there was a lot of ion energy being directed into that ship. And it didn't destroy the ship. They're not meant to do that. They're just supposed to disable it so the ship would be able to recover over time. But yeah, Star Wars has a really nasty habit of taking something that should be relatively simple and then dialing it up by about 1,000 times of what's necessary, and then using that as a feat of strength. So, like, yes, you can inflict a lot of damage temporary damage on a ship the size of a Star Destroyer, but if the cannon that you need in order to do that shoots out blasts of energy that are the size of your entire hangar, that's not that impressive and also can't really be mounted on a ship. No Star Destroyer has, well, maybe Super Star Destroyers, I honestly don't know, but none of them have ion cannons on that kind of scale. Also, ion cannons suffer from the exact same range and accuracy and speed limitations that blasters do, making them relatively hard, unwieldy at least, in combat. Alright, I should also touch briefly on fighter weaponry. Suffice to say, they don't hit as hard as turbolasers, but hit harder than handheld blasters, and are capable of beating down not only the armor, but the shields of other fighters and bombers. Beyond that, their yield is pretty unclear. Alright, I'm going to move on from Imperial weaponry and over onto Federation weapons. I won't get into every single weapon we see since it's unnecessary, and I'll instead focus on phasers and photon torpedoes. Quantum torpedoes are functionally identical to photon torpedoes, just higher yield, so I'll skip over them. I'll start with phasers, and here we get some interesting mixed messages. On the one hand, the TNG manual says that Type 10 phaser emitters, like those on the Galaxy-class starship, each emit 5.1 megawatts of energy, with each phaser array consisting of 200 emitters, which combine their output for lower or higher energy shots. But the same entry also says that Type 1 and 2 phasers, so phaser pistols, output 0.01 megawatts of energy, and with that 0.01 megawatts, they can vaporize a person. I had AI run some numbers for me, since despite the flaws of AI, doing math is something it's actually really good at, and it figures that vaporizing a 200-pound human would require about 3.9 gigajoules of energy, for a discrepancy between reality and tech manual of about 390,000 times. So if you apply this factor to the other numbers they provided, you end up with a total array output of 397.8 terawatts, or about 95 megatons per second output from the Galaxy-class phaser array. Looking at on-screen evidence, we have a couple data points. One, in TNG Season 7, Episode 10, Inheritance, a sustained 19-second shot drilled a hole into the mantle of a planet to fix some geological issues. It's unclear what the diameter of this hole was, but we can assume it was between 1 and 10 meters in diameter for the upper and lower limits. For 1 meter diameter, that's 18.8 megatons, and for 10 meters, that's 1.88 gigatons. But this is spread over 19 seconds, so that low end is about 990 kilotons per second, and the high end is about 99 megatons per second. That is, assuming that the rock involved was vaporized, since that makes the most sense visually, the alternative being total atomic disintegration, but that's rather more difficult to quantify. But hey! That number from the 10-meter hole actually jives almost perfectly with the adjusted tech manual. Neat! The other data point we can point to is from Strange New Worlds Season 3, Episode 10, New Life and New Civilizations, where the crew outright says that their phasers can output 1.61 times 10 to the 26 watts, or half the energy output of Earth's sun each. Seriously, they even actually contextualize it as being half the output of the sun. Like they said, we need the entire energy output of the sun. Well, one phaser can handle half of that, so I guess we need two. So they weren't just throwing out numbers that were insane, they actually did it intentionally. Oh yeah, that's 38.5 petatons of TNT per second, and the prefixes go kilo, mega, giga, tera, peta, you get the idea. So yeah, the turbo lasers that I've talked about, those are in the kilo range, and the other phasers that I've talked about so far have been in the more mega range. This skips a few orders of magnitude. We could then reasonably assume that Strange New World sets a good benchmark for energy output from phasers, especially since it takes place about 100 years prior to the Dominion War, and it's even corroborated by an event during that war. In Deep Space Nine Season 3, Episode 21, The Die is Cast, a combined fleet of 20 Romulan and Cardassian ships, which devastated the founder of Homeworld, destroying about 30% of the crust in some unspecified but short amount of time. Granted, they were using a combination of disruptors and torpedoes, but in order to actually inflict damages on defenses that are supposed to resist such firepower, you can't have one kind of weaponry just hitting millions of times harder than the other kinds, so the weaker kinds won't actually do anything in that kind of context. Anyway, for the sake of argument, let's assume that all those ships were just using disruptors and that those weapons were the equivalent to the 100-year-old phasers used in Strange New Worlds. That would mean that the Founder world was being hit by about 10 of our sun's total energy output every second, which would destroy the aforementioned 30% of the crust. Assuming that the crust was pulverized and dispersed but not vaporized in about 2 minutes and 41 seconds, which actually jives with what we see on screen pretty well. Sounds like the numbers that the writers of Strange New Worlds were throwing out weren't actually all that unreasonable after all, at least there was precedent there. There is one major caveat though. The task force attacking the Founder homeworld was basically helpless against the Dominion counterattack that occurred after their initial salvo, and the Strange New Worlds feat wasn't a combat scenario at all. What this tells me is that this level of energy output isn't really a combat feat, it's just a technical feat. Sure, they can hit that hard, but only if they're not powering shields or impulse engines or cloaking devices or long-range sensors. It's the same kind of situation as the Venator, except that phasers actually are designed to channel that kind of energy, as demonstrated by these multiple feats, but that's not really a reasonable expectation you can have for middle of combat. So yeah, you could do that in the middle of combat is what I should say, but it would be pretty unwise in most encounters. So with all that said, I'm sticking with the earlier estimate of 95 megatons per second output as a representative output of the phasers. As for range and accuracy, phasers are fantastic. Their effective range is 300,000 kilometers, or 1 light second, as corroborated by the TNG Season 4 Episode 12 episode The Wounded, and their targeting is highly precise as demonstrated almost every time that someone orders something like target their weapons or target their bridge. Keep in mind, combat situations in Trek are often happening at significant fractions of the speed of light, so you're not only hitting a ship that's a few hundred meters long, but hitting just a specific part of that ship while it's moving crazy fast. That's pretty impressive. As for photon torpedoes, we run into a bit of an issue, mainly because the math doesn't really make any sense. On the one hand, the tech manual provides us with the information that the standard payload for a photon torpedo is 1.5 kilograms of antimatter, which, when reacting with 1.5 kilograms of matter, should result in a yield of about 65 megatons, so they don't hit as hard as phasers. Well, that doesn't make any sense. Why would you bother using torpedoes at all if you can only carry a few of them and you can fire your phasers all day? Well, for one thing, they have configurable yield, which is represented by things like heavy torpedoes, which carry 10 kilograms of antimatter for a yield of 430 megatons. For another, all photon torpedoes are designed to be able to continue at warp if fired at warp, so they're fantastic for flyby situations. Finally, they can be given guidance systems that don't necessarily need to follow linear paths to enemies, unlike phasers. Probably the clearest and most famous example of this was from Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, where a torpedo was customized via emergency surgery by Dr. McCoy and Spock to be able to follow a plasma trail, ultimately allowing the torpedo to track and strike a Klingon bird of prey that could fire while cloaked. So it fires this super winding path and eventually catches up to the bird of prey because it was tracking their exhaust. This means having ship geometry that is set up to protect less defended areas of the ship isn't necessarily going to protect you against photon torpedoes, since they can just adjust course and strike from whatever vector with configurable speeds and everything as well. As for range, photon torpedoes can hit targets at 2.5 million kilometers away. I should also mention that mines have their place in Star Trek and are absolutely terrifying. The most famous example were the cloaked, self-replicating mines from DS9, which could shred whole fleets and then just self-replicate and be good as new. I should also mention now that one of the big differences between Star Trek and Star Wars weaponry in general is that Star Trek will have one thing. So like the Galaxy class, it'll have its forward phaser array and then a dorsal or ventral, whatever, phaser array. They won't have any ships just bristling with weapons most of the time. The Scimitar from Nemesis was an exception. It had like 50 disruptors or something like that. Star Wars, on the other hand, all their weapons are individuals and they're all mounted on turrets. So like the Imperial 2 Star Destroyer, yes, each turbo laser is only hitting with, I would argue, a few kilotons of energy, but they have 60 turbo laser turrets. Each, I think, are dual turbo laser turrets, so that's 120 turbo lasers. And they have 60 ion cannon turrets as well, so they're absolutely bristling with weaponry, even though each of those individual hits isn't hitting all that hard, at least in cosmic terms. Kilotons of energy per hit is still a lot of energy, but we are talking about starships that can crack planets, so in that context it's not as much. Alright, what's the verdict here? Oh, hang on. I forgot to talk about force powers and the Death Star. Oh, okay. This one's getting actually pretty long, so I'll talk about them in the unique advantages section in a few weeks, but yeah, the verdict. Suffice to say, the Empire is pretty thoroughly outgunned here. Their weapons are much shorter range, don't hit nearly as hard, at least individually, though you get enough of them together and they might be kind of comparable, but you would need an awful lot of them to match a single phaser. And by an awful lot of them, I mean 9,500 of them. Yeah, no Star Destroyer has that many. The Death Star has that many. On the ground, I don't think that this disadvantage will actually matter all that much, since blasters work fine against cloth uniforms, but in space, it's going to cause a lot of problems for the Imperial Navy. But what do you all think? Am I skipping over something I shouldn't? Am I misrepresenting anything? Did I mess up my math? Let me know in the comments. Again, I have links to my Patreon, Coffee, and Fourth Wall in the description if you'd like to support the channel. Patreon is where I'll be hosting a discussion regarding a breakdown just like this one for the matchup between Protoss and Eldar that I've been putting off because it intimidates me. And until next time, live long and prosper, and may the Force be with you.